Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Today, we're going to be learning about learning to see waste in a transactional world. And our presenter today is Colleen Fons, and she is one of our employees here at Innovia. She is one of our project delivery managers. And as always, if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get them answered. And if you do have any questions and you want to raise your hand, feel free to use the little hand raise down at the bottom of your panel. And we will go ahead and get started in just a few moments. Okay, first, how about we start with an icebreaker? What's the most unusual place you've ever visited? And I'm going to unmute you if you would like to talk, or if you want to put something in the chat, you can go ahead and do that. Anyone? How about you, Colleen? What's the most unusual place that you've ever visited?
Hey,
Okay.
Kevin, I didn't hear your interesting answer. What's the most interesting place you've ever been?
That's a stumper. I tell you what, fascinating from a manufacturing standpoint was I was in a place in Peoria that manufactured box wire fence. And I think the equipment they had there was circa 1890.
Wow, and still operating.
It's
Wow.
still operating. I mean, and it, as somebody in a manufacturing background, to stand here and watch how this very rudimentary machine took wire and formed box wire fence. I mean, I could have spent an afternoon there just watching that machine.
Fascinating. They just don't make things like they used to, Kevin.
Back in my day.
So,
Perfect. All right.
Colleen, we'll go ahead and have you kick it off. And like I said, if anybody has any questions, just go ahead and either raise your hand or come off mute and we can get your question addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. So really love group participation, y'all, because I really don't want to listen to myself talk for an hour. And probably you don't either. So definitely this is intended to be interactive. And really, at the end of the day, my hope is that you come away being able to look at processes and being able to see waste, right? How do we look at our processes different? It creates a new lens with which to look at our processes. And so what we're going to be going through today is, kind of touch on the background of this is really coming from lean or continuous improvement. We're going to actually define what waste means, right? So people talk about, oh, they ate waste, Well, what exactly does waste mean? So go into a little bit about the definition there. And then really, this is in general, but it specifically also does relate to ERP implementations. And so on, I kind of hit on how does this relate to ERP implementations? But again, this is more general. It's for any process to really be able to look at things differently. We'll go through the 8 types of waste themselves and go through examples of each, and then different ways to kind of try to attack that waste. We'll talk about some different complementary continuous improvement tools. Again, this is kind of as part of a whole suite, right? It's just one tool, part of a whole suite of tools. And then we'll just summarize things up. And again, please feel free to jump in as we're going through this. Really want this to be interactive so that it's as valuable for you as possible. So lean and continuous improvement, they focus on 4 things, right? So it's safe. It's always safety first. You always say, hey, how do we make sure that we're doing things safer? And then quality, and then speed, and then efficiency, right? And so anytime we're looking at process improvement, anytime that we're looking at just reducing waste, we should always be taking these 4 things into account. Now for ERP implementations, right, system stuff, there isn't necessarily as much safety. I mean, one could say, hey, ergonomics, how many times am I clicking the button? But always we want to keep that in the forefront of our minds is safety, quality, speed, and efficiency. And so anytime we look at a process, those should always be like, how does this affect those four things? So the background of this is, so Taiichi Ono, he was really considered like, the godfather of lean. And so he worked for Toyota, the Toyota production system, right, known as also lean. And he said, hey, all we're doing is looking at a timeline from the moment the customer gives us an order, you could also say quote, but to the point when we collect the cash. And we're reducing that timeline by removing the non-value added wastes. And so the whole idea is speed wins, right? So in most processes, when you look around the world, speed wins, right? Amazon proves speed wins. And so if we can take that timeline, in order to shrink that timeline, you essentially have to eliminate waste. And so when you look at so many of our general business processes, there's so much waste, right? Of waiting, it's just things take much longer than they need to. And if we could actually reduce that speed, we would be more profitable. Typically, your quality is better because you're not redoing things 4 times, right? You have a higher hit rate. For example, with quoting, speed wins. If I can generate a quote faster than the competition, oftentimes my hit rate or my success rate is higher. And so here's the concept. If you just think of it as a timeline, how do we reduce that timeline? By essentially removing the non-value added wastes. So what is waste, right? So we talk about waste all the time, but it's an activity that consumes resources, but brings no value to the end customer. And so there are different kinds of waste. And so one could say, well, my legal team doesn't bring value to the end customer, or my HR team doesn't bring value to the end customer. Well, there's a necessary waste, and then there's just pure waste, right? And so making sure that you've identified, unfortunately, there is some waste that is necessary. But at the end of the day, how do you try to make those processes more efficient, right? So sure, we need to put in quality checks, for example, into our processes because it doesn't fundamentally add value to the end product or service, but you need those in place to catch defects, to ensure you can circle back and improve processes, et cetera. So how do you look at those processes and at least try to refine them as much as possible? Those are the necessary wastes. Now, then there's just pure waste, and that's really the focus that you try to go after. And these things where if you removed something from the process, right, there would be no negative impact on the safety of your employees or your customers, the quality of your products, or the performance or longevity of your company. And so that's what we want to focus on, is the pure waste and reducing that timeline like Taiichi Ono had talked about. Now, for something to be value added, again, kind of getting further down into that definition chain, well, 3 things must be true. So the work must change the form or function of the product or service. So essentially something had to change, right? The customer must be willing to pay for the change, and the work must be performed correctly the first time. So I have I used to work at GE Healthcare, and so did my husband. And so he was working in one of the modalities in MR, and engineers had come up with what they thought was this really cool new feature, right? And spent significant amount of time putting development into this new feature. Well, at the end of the day, the customer didn't care, right? So the customers were not willing to pay for this change. So when they went to market with it, they weren't able to substantiate a price increase. There was nobody who's willing to pay more for this. And so at the end of the day, although the engineers thought that was incredibly value added, they were completely disconnected from the customer. The customer really didn't care. It was not important to them. And so really ensuring, right, when we define value added, we have to say, hey, is this something that the customer agrees is value added and that they would, be willing to quote unquote pay for the change. So when we look at our processes, always thinking of your customer. Your customer can be, for example, could be an internal customer. Does my customer say this is value added? My internal customer, right? Somebody down the chain in my process, but essentially making sure that who is defining what's value added is not necessarily the person who's doing the job, should be the one to define the value add. So how does this relate to ERP, right? ERP implementations. Well, when you're doing an implementation, that is the best time to really evaluate your processes and say, okay, great. It's not necessarily sometimes, some people be like, we just want to replicate exactly what we're doing in the old system and do it in the new system. And it's like, well, maybe it's a good time to really think, are we doing things efficiently? Are we doing things effectively? Are there opportunities for improvement? Now's the time to really to make that change, given you're going to be implementing a brand new system. This helps really provide a lens, right? A framework through which to look at your processes. And so here's what I have found. So I've done a lot of Lean Six Sigma in prior roles in GE and in Eaton. And what I find is oftentimes that people make their processes they're almost personal, right? Where it's almost like they birth this process, and it's very hard for them to separate themselves from the process. Where if somebody were to say, hey, this process kind of stinks, they literally, it was like you just called their baby ugly. And so if we can talk about processes with people who do these processes and through this different lens or framework, how can we teach people about waste and try to disconnect them as if, it's like, hey, this is not somebody calling your baby ugly. This is somebody saying, hey, there's in every process, there's opportunity for improvement. And this just provides us a lens or a framework through which to look at a process. Reasons why something is the way it is, they're not always still relevant. And so really kind of going through, another tool, that 5 why exercise. I'm sure, many people have heard of that. It's why do you do something? They'll give you a reason, and then you have to keep drilling. Okay, well, why is that? Well, why is that? And oftentimes you'll find that a process was put in place when there was a parameter, or a limitation that no longer exists. And so oftentimes people are doing things a certain way, and maybe the underlying reason as to why they had to do it that way is no longer there. And so really getting to the core and trying to understand why is it that somebody feels something is necessary really helps to figure out if there are things that could be improved upon. We talked about the change management a little bit about that, removing that personal aspect. When we're doing these implementations, we do find that sometimes you'll have barriers in your organization of people who are very afraid of change, right? So there's the whole, how is that going to affect my job? Am I still going to have a job? But really, how do we help kind of remove that personal aspect, take a step back, look through it, different lens together, and I help identify waste. It makes somebody also feel more engaged, right? So instead of me going in and saying, hey, this process is really, really quite bad, sitting together with them, teaching them about this kind of mindset, and then having them help identify opportunities for improvement, they feel more engaged. They feel like, hey, my opinion is valuable, my input matters. And quite frankly, if they own the process, it's they're going to have more buy-in at the end of the day if they had to help say as to the changes that would be made. And then at the end of the day, an automated crappy process is still a crappy process. And so although we can automate things, oftentimes we spend time automating and doing development around maybe things that aren't, or processes that aren't optimal. And so we definitely want to look at our processes first before going to automate them. Any questions or commentary thus far before I keep going here?
Hey,
No
Colleen,
questions have come through. Oh, sorry.
Yes.
you touched on change management twice. In your experience, how big of a roadblock is that for you when it comes to eliminating waste?
It's one of the largest roadblocks. We are, right now we have a project going on where there's a lot of fear, right? We've, talked to the management team and said, hey guys, there's a lot of fear in your team where people are incredibly afraid that, hey, these processes, I won't understand them, or will this eliminate my job because they're coming from green screen. I mean, if you think that far back, right? They're coming literally from an 80s, 90s green screen. And so they're having a hard time getting people even to test, right? So the project is dragging on for months and months longer than it should be because the role of kind of that whole change management process. It's a process. It's an intentional process that you have to go through as an organization. It needs to start at the top, and it needs to be very intentional. And how do we include people, and how do we over communicate, and how do we set up operating mechanisms to understand people's concerns and fears, and how do we engage them in the change itself. So, it's an enormous part of a successful project. Any sort of project is really engaging the people who will be doing the work into the change itself. And so there's a whole change management. I mean, there are books around change management, right? They have special tools to help you kind of walk through and identify, for example, hey, who are going to be your major roadblocks? This is one of the tools that we used before on one of a major project that I was on, was identifying, hey, who could possibly bring this project to its knees, right? And so you identify the people in your organization that have a lot of pull, right? So people, for example, you may have that person that's been doing a job for 30 years and everyone looks to them as the expert. And if they say, no, everyone else is going to follow suit. And so learning how to engage that person early on, and how do you get their buy-in, and how do you help make them a leader, because usually they're opinionated, right? So how do you make it where they're so engaged and invested that everyone follows them, so everyone's going to want to follow behind them. And so it's really a hugely important process at the beginning of any project, whether it be ER implementation or anything else. But absolutely, we see this as a major game changer for clients who do not kind of attend to that change management need of their organization. All right, you good? Was that a good enough answer for you, Kevin?
Oh, yeah. I just wanted your perspective on it because, and you touch on the fear.
Right, it is fear. That's the base of it. It's fear, right?
So, thank you.
Yep, and I didn't realize when I'm sharing my screen, I guess because it's not on Teams, that my pings are keep coming up. All right, so 8 types of waste. So these are very, specific types of waste. And these, what you'll usually see is you see these in the transactional, or I'm sorry, in the production realm. So, sorry, 1 second, I'm gonna, disturb myself. So you typically see these related to production, but they very much are also applicable in the transactional world. And so companies over the last 20 years have really worked to translate lean, quote unquote, lean from production to the transactional world. And so you can see in orange here, right? It's Tim, would you? And so this is a way where you can kind of memorize. I'm big on, I have to have little games and ways to memorize things because my memory is shot. So I'm always like, you can say, you would, Tim, or Tim, would you? Like I do these little games to try to remember things, but that's how you can remember the 8 types of waste. There originally was only 7. And in the last 20 years or so, they added this last one, this underutilized people, as an additional waste. So we're going to go through each one of these. And I'd love for y'all to really kind of jump in with each one, and maybe give, if you have an example in your world where you see this waste is just really, abundant or incredibly painful, or you have a really, what you feel is, a pertinent example, please definitely share. So we're going to go through these wastes. So first one is waste of transportation. So this is actually the needless movement of work. So the work itself, not the people doing the work, but the actual work. Think about it as that, if I was moving something around, if I'm moving the work around. And so the biggest example here that I have seen has been handoffs and approvals. A perfect example I have of this one, I was doing a Kaizen event with a group up in Quebec. It was an order entry team. And so they would enter the order into the system, and then they would hand it off to the sales rep. And the sales rep had to then review it and approve it, and then send it back to the order entry person, who would then, submit essentially the order to be released to the warehouse. And so that process was, just I questioned it, because I'm like, well, that's 2 weeks. So, those salespeople, we all know those salespeople, Kevin, but those salespeople take forever And so I questioned, I'm like, okay, well, what value does that salesperson add? Yeah, what exactly are they doing? They're like, well, they're reviewing it and checking it. And then as we're going through the conversation, I was like, well, what exactly are they checking though? Is there something from a quality perspective that, could be worked on so that there's nothing that quote unquote could be wrong? Like, what are they checking? And then it came down to, well, we don't even really trust the salespeople anyways. So we double check it and we just enter the order. And so my question to them was, so if you eliminated the salesperson in that process and did not hand off the order to them whatsoever, would it at all affect the quality or the customer? And they're like, they looked at me kind of shocked that I would even, that this question was being asked. And then they realized that they literally didn't have to hand these orders off to the salespeople. And so again, speed wins, right? And so customers now could get their products 2 weeks sooner than what they were getting them before, because we eliminated a handoff that was completely unnecessary. And if you think of approvals, for example, if you're ever in an approval chain where it literally feels like a pencil whipping exercise, where you're like, I always say yes to this, or hey, if we could put in some logic that why don't you send it for approval if it's above a certain amount, right? Or if it, meets a certain criteria, rather than everything gets handed off for approval. And so 99% of it is a pencil whipping exercise, and it's really just the 1% that needed to be reviewed. And so again, the whole focus is that Taiichi Ono comment is, how do you reduce that timeline, right? Extensively. Well, handoffs result in an enormous amount of waiting, which is essentially another waste. And a lot of these wastes kind of interact, right? And so handoffs equal waiting. And so if we can eliminate handoffs, and if we can combine jobs, or saying, hey, I could do this step and this, or combine steps in a process, you essentially can significantly cut that timeline down. And so, potential solutions, approvals, having again exception management, where only certain things go through, but are just auto approved. You don't need to go through the approval process. Again, challenge every handoff. Is it necessary? What value does it add? Could tasks be combined? Not sending a document around for multiple people to work on independently, but people could be working on the document simultaneously, etc. Any questions on this one, or any examples that are just glaringly hurting your processes or organization? All right, we'll move to the next one. So the next one is inventory. So this is the work that is waiting and or piling up. And so transactional examples, obviously in a warehouse, you walk into a warehouse, and so you can see inventory piling up, right? And it's a problem. You're like, oh, anytime there's inventory piling up, there's an issue, there's a problem. And it's a quick visual, right? You can easily see it. I can easily walk over there and say, okay, what is happening here? Well, in our transactional world, it's a little bit harder. And so, examples, emails, work order entry queues, purchase order queues, my action items, product development pipelines. And, some people are like, well, why is this a waste? Well, anytime something is building up, again, that whole timeline, right? We're talking about that timeline. The goal is to reduce that timeline. If things are piling up, there's going to be a long wait. But not only that, but while something is piling up, there may have been something that changed that may affect that queue, right? It was, hey, I have, a bunch of orders piling in for inventory, and we told the people that this was available, but, now it's not going to be available because there are 10 orders in front of it that just used up that inventory. So thinking of, as something is piling up, variables or conditions could change, where you now have to go back and say, oh, okay, well, something is no longer valid, or something has changed. And again, we don't want the long wait. The long wait hurts customer service. It hurts, just the longer something sits without being worked on, somebody forgets and has to pick things back up and try to figure out where they left off, etc. So potential solutions. A big thing around inventory in the transactional space is, how do you create a visual management system? And so how do you see, like you would in a warehouse, how do you see your inventory piling up? So I have an example of this one, where we had a strategic bid process, and I was in charge of 6 quoting teams that had different product lines. And we would have something called strategic bids. And so we dealt with things like transformers, line protective equipment. So our customers, our biggest customers, were the utility companies. And when you lost a utility company, it was a massive hit to your P&L because these multi-million-dollar a year customers. And so we had a process called strategic bids. And so what would happen is the utility company would come in and say, hey, we need you to bid out, we want to buy 100 of this type of transformer. We want to buy 500 of this, 400 of this. And again, multi-million-dollar contract opportunity. And so they would bid these things out every year. You weren't guaranteed a multi-year contract. They would obviously go to the 3 big competitors and every year say, okay, come with your quote. And so when I first started, we only sent these quotes out on time to these customers, these huge utility customers, 14% of the time. And I was shocked. I'm like, these are your biggest opportunities. These are your biggest, if you lose this customer, right? Or if you gain this customer, huge impact on your P&L. And we didn't have a rigorous process because we couldn't see it. We literally could not see this process because we had to go to multiple quoting teams and we had to get feedback get them to like quote all of these, customized products essentially. Then we had to go to the marketing team, make sure they were good with it. But there were all of these teams that had to be involved and we had no way of visually seeing it. So we put in place a visual management workflow essentially to show the milestones where it was at. And it was really rudimentary. It was an access, right? It was, I built it, which means it was really rudimentary. And so we went just simply this alone by putting in this visual management system, we went from 14% to submitting these quotes on time to 98% of submitting the quotes on time, simply by creating a visual process, right? So that our inventory was no longer invisible and we couldn't track it. So that I say is the biggest thing in the transactional world is these critical processes. Make sure you create a visual management tool so that you can see where they are building up. And then of course, anywhere you can automate something and eliminate the queue, right? If I can do something with AP automation or EDI or API versus having a person have to manually do something, obviously a huge win. Any questions or examples on this that anyone would like to share?
I had an AP automation one, and you talk about people being afraid of losing their job. They would rotate people in to do purchase invoice reconciliation, what we've referred to as stare and compare to the purchase order. And you want to talk about, they had to drag them kicking and screaming, hey, it's your week to go over and do this job. There was no resistance to that change.
Right.
There was people in that department goes, well, if it costs us one person, so be it, but we won't have to do that anymore.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and the other thing with what I've said to people is when you're doing the change management, you have to make sure that you have committed to your team that the changes won't if they're participating in continuous improvement, that the change is not, hey, people are going to lose their job. Oftentimes if there's kind of quote unquote fat, there's enough opportunity where organizations, a lot of organizations aren't necessarily great at, I would say, performance management, where if you need to reduce, right, really focus on performance management and never ever, hey, well, we automated this, therefore you lose your job, right? How do you kind of move people around, but make sure that it's very clear that people who are losing their job are not losing it because of continuous improvement, but rather you're becoming a better organization and making sure that you're holding people accountable, doing performance management, or setting yourself up for growth, right? So a lot of companies, are growing and say, hey, how do when we can take on more of this without having to add additional people. So really focusing on that, with that fear and making sure, because people will be afraid if all of a sudden you're doing continuous improvement and a bunch of people lost their job because of it, right? So people will stop participating in continuous improvement essentially. So it's a very sensitive area. So the next one is motion. So the transportation, what we talked about up front, was the needless movement of the work itself, and motion is the needless movement of people, right? So Am I constantly searching for files or records on my computer or my network, right? Do I have a poor work area layout that, heaven forbid, I'm still printing something, but I have to, go, or if I'm always needing to talk to somebody and they're, across the way and it's, I always need to do it in person. So kind of looking at our layouts, and then entering information more than one time. And so solutions. So to me, a big one is this whole, the AI, right? So I'm thinking of, hey, like when I created, I'm not going to lie, when I created this PowerPoint presentation, originally for our customer conference, I didn't realize that you could use Copilot to help you create presentations. And so I probably spent 15 hours like creating this presentation and trying to make things look pretty and reorganizing things. And it doesn't even look as pretty as if I would have used AI, right? And so our sales leader, Trish, actually got on and was like, hey, watch this. I can quickly create a PowerPoint presentation using Copilot. And I just wanted to throw my computer out the window because I had just spent this ridiculous amount of time creating this presentation, right? So I'm like, there are a lot of things I could be using to work smarter, not harder. That would have greatly reduced the number of clicks that I did trying to drag things around, align them, make them look pretty, and just it gives me nightmares thinking about the fact that I could have used Copilot. So AI, I think, is going to be a big opportunity here to reduce, reduce, I would say administrative type tasks, even when I'm writing a paragraph and I'm like, I can throw it in now and say, could you make this more concise? Could you make this, more professional or, or more, less, more casual. So using AI, I think will be a huge opportunity for improvement to reduce this waste and over processing. And we'll talk about that one in a minute. Going forward, but even autofill, right? Autofill, forms, macros, formulas, search engines, multiple monitors. I mean, I see some people still working on their single monitor, I'm like, first of all, I don't even know how you function. But second of all, think of all the times you need to be looking back and forth, at multiple screens at a time. And so NBC itself, if we talk about NBC, hey, how do you remove the extras, right? Personalize the roles, etc. So people aren't tabbing through extra fields, right? It's only what's needed is there. So always thinking about how can I reduce the amount of clicks essentially that I'm having to do, because most of us aren't physically walking around a lot in our transactional type jobs. Most of it, the motion is the clicks, right? It's how I'm clicking and clicking and clicking and clicking or, doing work. Anybody have any questions on this one or anything they'd like to add? All right, we'll go to waiting. So again, a lot of these interplay, right? So any delay between when one process step ends and the next one begins. And so waiting is when we're talking about the whole timeline, that Taiichi Ohno timeline, waiting, if you've actually have done a value stream map where it's what you do is you literally take every process step and you not just do the process map, but you add in all the times. You add in not only the time to actually do the process itself or the step itself, but then you put in all the waiting times between those steps. Typically, 80% plus of any process is waiting. And so of that whole timeline, right? The whole process timeline, at least 80% of any timeline is typically waiting. And so really trying to identify where is that waiting happening and what can be done to eliminate that waiting will be the biggest impact you'll have on speed. And again, in so many processes, speed wins, whether it's customer satisfaction, hit rate, et cetera. And so waiting for development, waiting for approval or information, slow response time. And so how do you attack waiting essentially as well? The biggest thing you can do is if I can prevent a handoff, that's the best thing I can do. So we had a couple processes where it was being handed off from one person to the other, where there was no technical reason for it to have to be handled by two people. It wasn't as if it was, hey, this requires, a lawyer to review the T's and C's, or it didn't require any special expertise. And so we looked at ways that we could combine steps and then kind of adjust workloads to say, okay, this one person could actually do step 1 and step 2, and you do not need to hand it to the next person. And that drastically reduced the whole process lead time. Again, that visible workflow. So how do you create visual management so that you can see things when they're stuck? So many times things are stuck in our inboxes, right? Email is the worst process flow tool ever. And so many of us use email for these processes. These processes are just completely in a black hole in our emails. And so you, at the end of the day, you have no idea how long things are taking. You can't see when they're stuck. There's no way to create kind of automation around escalations to say, oh, hey, this has been stuck for 3 days, right? There's a customer on the end of this, or there's an opportunity at the end of this. We're going to lose, or we're going to, hurt a customer, whatever it is. And so really making sure to try to get your processes out of email, your critical processes out of email as much as possible. And then again, balancing workloads, cross training, like I talked about, hey, the person had to do a little more training on something, but then they were able to take on step 2 of the process as well as step 1. And then if you have times where you have, hey, we know we have incredibly cyclical times and we need to be able to say, hey, bring on some additional help potentially for 2 months out of the year to keep things moving, may be an option. Any thoughts or input or questions on waiting? All right, so the next one is overprocessing. And this is one that people have a hard time identifying. And so to me, this is one, I see it all the time. It's doing more work than is necessary to satisfy your customers or making the job harder than it should be. And this also could be, the example of that whole PowerPoint thing where there was a much easier way for me to do the job. And I just at the time was not aware of it, but I could have done it in probably a quarter of the time and it probably would have looked prettier. Right. And so are there areas that we're making the job harder than it should be, or doing even more work than is what is required? So are you really requiring more signatures than what is needed, right? If you're looking at approval processes, do you really need all the signatures that you're asking for? Are you asking for information that's not really used? I'm the one that probably annoys the heck out of people. And I'm like, well, why do you need this? I've given you this information monthly now for the last, year, and I don't see anything that's done with it. Are you doing anything with this? Because I'm not going to give it to you if you're not doing anything with it. Writing paragraphs, we have a process that we do, a functional requirement document, and it used to be all paragraph based. So we would spend a lot of time trying to write pretty paragraphs when we could have been using drop downs and check boxes and been much more concise. And it would probably been a lot easier to read than asking your customers to read a 150-page document of, well-written paragraphs. And so it wasn't that the customers were asking for us to write these beautifully written paragraphs. It's no, we need to be able to say, hey, here's what we heard you say. You need this, you need this, you need that. And so really understanding, are you really basing it on what would add value to your customer, right? So that's doing more work than what my customers require, because on our side, we're like, well, we have to write it in a paragraph. Well, we actually didn't. And so we're looking at redoing our own processes internally at Innovia to say, yeah, we made it harder than it needed to be. Are you asked to enter the same information more than once? My dad's least favorite thing when we go to the doctor, he's like, I swear I've entered this 4 times already. Right? Is there a way that you could, enter it once and have it proliferate through wherever it needs to go? Tracking actions and work in multiple locations. So this is one where we just put in place a new project management software, and we're trying to get away from all of our Excel workbooks, right? Because we feel like we're updating the same action item in multiple places, where if we could do it in one place, it would really prevent this, doing more work than what is required, because it doesn't add more value for me to add the same thing in 3 different locations. And then, poor planning would lead to expediting. I had a role where I had some planners and buyers that worked for me. And when I took the job, at least 80% of their time was literally firefighting and expediting, because we had a terrible planning process. And so we really focused for the next year on improving our planning processes, and their jobs got so much easier. And, at the end, a guy who'd been doing that job for 30 years, he goes, I never thought that I would say that I don't have to work 60 hours a week and I can work my 40 hours a week and go home, and the customers are getting better served. Well, poor planning, right, results in more work and making something harder than it should be. So planning, planning, planning. So potential solutions, again, it's this approvals and handoffs. How do we make sure, always be critical of those, always create those visible workflows. Again, a recurring theme, balancing your workloads, creating standardized work. So this is another kind of basic lean tool per se. Standard operating procedures. It's a joke with my husband where I hate cooking, like more than I can describe. I hate cooking. And so I will use the same ingredients every single time that I make spaghetti sauce. And I don't know why, but every single time it tastes different, because I don't measure anything, of course, and I don't have the same order of operations, and I don't, keep it at the same heat every time. And my husband's like, well, can you make it like this again next time? It was really good this time. And I was like, nope, because I have no idea what I did different, nor do I care enough to write it down. But it's the whole, we could all think we're doing something, the same way, and we're truly not. And so getting people in a room together who do the process and try to define a standard, right, to start with. And so that's always a fun process if you're dealing with a bunch of people who've been doing it for many years and have varying opinions. And so my theory was always I would put that safety, quality, speed, and efficiency up on the board. And every single time there's a disagreement on the way a process should be done, I'd point to the board and say, okay, how does that affect quality? Or safety? How does that affect quality? How does that affect speed, right? And how does that affect efficiency? And so really creating that standardized work with that efficiency, speed, quality, safety in mind. And that way you ensure that people are doing it the same way, but you can iterate from there and continuously reduce the waste, make it easier, and not doing more work than what is required. And again, Copilot. I am, again, a huge fan, and try to figure out now how I can use it more in my work to reduce the unnecessary waste of overprocessing. Any examples anybody has on this one, or any thoughts they'd like to share, or questions on overprocessing? All right, we will go on to overproduction. So overproduction is producing more than what is required or sooner than what is required. And so this one is, some people have a harder time translating this into the transactional space from the manufacturing space, but it definitely does apply. And so if I'm purchasing items before they are needed, right? I'm providing a service before the customer is ready. I'm producing unnecessary or excessive reports. And one might say, well, who cares if you provide the service before the customer is ready? Well, there may be something that changes between the time you provided it and when the customer is ready. There could have been something that, hey, fundamentally, this needs to change because we've now learned this, right? Now, not that you want to be late, but sometimes providing something too early is actually a bad thing as well. Purchasing items before they are needed, obviously, again, requirements could change. You have cash output that you didn't need to have at that time. You have things building up. And then the whole reports, again, I think every organization, there's an opportunity to really take a close look at what reports are being produced, who's using them. Are they still really necessary? Is everything on the report still truly required? Because I know internally, again, I stopped providing information just to see if anyone would complain, and no one complained. And I realized I've been doing this every month and no one was actually using the information. So definitely an opportunity to take a look at your reports and how they're being used and by whom. And so, try to create pull processes where you can, and obviously planning and communication is critical for this waste. Any questions about this particular waste? All right, and then defects. So defects, pretty obvious. So defects, as far as that whole timeline, anytime I have to do something over, obviously it increases that timeline, it increases the cost, it increases the customer dissatisfaction. If you have a customer, whoever your customer is, typically there's a customer in any process. And so design errors, order entry errors, like just, fat fingering type errors, missing information, rework. I have an example of this where when I had that team that did the quotations for multiple different product lines, I had a team that did just 3-phase transformers. And then I had a team that just did single-phase transformers. And then I had a team that just did the line and protective equipment. And then one that did just regulators, right? And, and switch gear. So I had 6 different quotation teams. And so that's all they did every day, was they would generate quotes for this equipment. However, we had the kind of more of the customer service team that they would be assigned these customers. And so they would do everything under the sun for the customers, figure out invoicing issues, generate requests for these quotes that they would then send over to those different quotation teams, depending on the product itself. But they had a million different things they had to deal with on a daily basis. And so they would be submitting requests on behalf of the customer for quotes for these different product lines. And I was shocked as to the amount of times that those people doing the quotes would say, well, I don't have all the information I need. And they would have to push it back to the customer service rep, who then oftentimes would have to go back to the customer. So, not a good look. The customer is telling us what they need. At that point, if we needed more information, you'd think we would have known to ask them. But then it's this whole handoff, like literally handoff loop. And the amount of waiting time with all those handoffs was enormous. And again, it didn't look like we did that for a living, it was a little embarrassing. And so I was talking to my quotation teams, they were complaining about the customer service reps, like, how many years have they done this job and they can't remember what you need for a 3-phase quote, or how many times, have they done this and they can't remember? And I'm like, you do this thing every day, all day. That's all you do. They do a million different things. And so what we did, I was like, nope, we're not complaining about people, because we're all human and nobody has a memory that good to remember all of these product lines, all of the products within those product lines and what's required. So we actually sat down and I made my quoting teams create checklists. And I was like, okay, we're gonna hit this straight on. So for every single product, I made them put together a checklist and say exactly what was required for the customer service rep to get from the customer in order to send it through, so that it was a first pass yield, right? The first time they got the information they needed to do the quote. And we reduced so many handoffs, so much time, so much customer dissatisfaction by simply putting in place these checklists. And at that time, we had a huge system. They wouldn't let us automate it immediately, which is fine. You probably shouldn't automate things up front. You probably should kind of vet them out and pilot them out. So we created these, big binders separated by product line where they could quickly flip, find it, go through the checklist. It was real old school, but it worked, right? At the end of the day, how are you creating processes that have error proofing in place? And did it completely error proof? No, but it made it hard to get it wrong, right? If someone was following the process, it made it hard to do their job wrong. And so as you're thinking about your processes, one, are you actually capturing your defects? So again, the whole visual management piece, are you actually tracking where you have defects? And really looking at those Paretos to say, what are the biggest bars? What are the biggest outliers? How am I making sure I'm tracking those defects? And then how can I put in place a process that makes it hard to do it wrong? And so this will heavily impact your productivity, your profitability, your customer satisfaction, usually your employee satisfaction. This was causing like an internal war between 2 departments, because one was saying the other department was stupid and the other one was highly offended and, thought that they were jerks, which was kind of valid. So potential solutions, standardized work. Again, how do you make sure everyone's doing something the same way? How can you error proof? Don't click button, Colleen. How can you error proof? How do you hold people accountable, right? So when people weren't following the process, we were still seeing defects. They weren't opening up their binders and going through the checklist. So I could go back and say, you now have a process, right? You're not following the process. And there was an accountability. So there were a couple people that I had to really work with on accountability to follow the process. Making sure you do have quality checks at critical milestones. And then providing examples and scenarios to validate understanding of requirements. So this is something where in our line of work, right, we need to make sure, for example, if we're drawing up a design doc for a customer who wants a modification, that we provide examples and test scenarios to say, hey, here's what we think you're saying. This is what this would look like at the end, to validate. Yep, that's what we meant. Yep, you got what we meant. Or nope, that's not exactly what we meant. So we don't have to go back and do rework. Any questions or comments on this one? Kevin, you've been very quiet.
I'm trying not to drag out your webinar for you.
So the last one, underutilized people. So this is the new one again that they added, right? So originally there were 7. This was the additional one they added. And so this one is, are you utilizing your people's skills, right? So sometimes you have a need in your organization and you have actually people who could fill that need, but they're just not in the right positions to be able to fill that need, or you haven't put it out there for them, right? So is there a way to kind of identify where you have a need, we have a gap here, we have this need, how can we help kind of look inside of our organization to see if there are people who have those skill sets, those interests, those passions, those talents that we are not yet pulling. And so, sometimes I've seen organizations do kind of like this quote unquote crowdsourcing, right? Like, hey, we want to, name a new product line, or we want to, do something, come up with at one of my organizations, it was the logo. They wanted to come up with a new logo for the company because the other one looked like it was from the 70s, and it was from the 70s, but it really looked like it. And so rather than paying a marketing organization thousands of dollars to come in to do this, he actually put it out internally, and somebody came up with a pretty cool logo, and they paid the guy like $2,000, right? So it's, how do you kind of utilize your team's skills that you may not know are out there when you have a need? So how do you empower and reward and publicly acknowledge people for going above and beyond, right? How do you, it's definitely something where I think most organizations have a huge opportunity to more fully understand their employees' interests and skill sets, and utilizing those to benefit the organization above and beyond just kind of what they're doing in their day-to-day job. So this is what I found working in, kind of, especially, when I worked in bigger organizations, is there are these silos, right? So there you have your sales team, and you have your order entry team. I even find this sometimes at Innovia, right? Where we have our teams and they're built in these silos, but yet the process has to go across our teams, right? Yet, how are we measuring people? Oftentimes, we'll be like, okay, the metrics, sales team, how are you doing here? Order entry team, how are you doing here? But the process goes left to right, right? Taiichi Ohno's comment was really about this whole value stream, right? Speeding that up, but yet all of our metrics and our accountability are vertical rather than horizontal, right? Our communication goes this way. We'll have team meetings. How often do you have meetings across the process? Very rarely. I mean, I very rarely have meetings where I'm like, hey, I want to meet with the people who cover a process to say, how do we make this whole process better? And so I have an example where an engineering team, their metric was to reduce material cost, right? And so that's what they had promote or bonuses on. This is what their major metrics were on. So what they were doing, and this is around transformers, they were actually taking the oil that goes in a transformer is really expensive. And so they'd be like, if we can reduce the oil in the transformer, right, we've saved this much on material cost. But what was not taken in consideration at all was every time that they did that, there had to be a brand new product set up, which affected the entire value stream. And so I did a project with the engineering manager, the supply chain manager, the manufacturing manager. And what I did is and the coding team, I wanted to show the impact of doing that. And it cost us 100-fold of what they actually saved by taking out a little oil of a transformer, because across the process, we had to set up new part numbers, right? The impact on quality, they had to change over the machines at times, right? It was the impact of the whole value stream was so enormous. But because the metrics were so micro, right? They were so just myopic. We were doing the absolute wrong thing for the organization and actually losing money, and it was impacting quality, so we're impacting the customers, simply because if we changed it and took out a little bit of oil, they were, they looked like they were doing better as an engineering team. And I don't blame them. This is how they were measured. So how do we make sure that we create our metrics, our operating mechanisms, our improvement initiatives across the process, because things flow downstream. They're not, subject to just our silos. And so some complementary continuous improvement tools here to think about, to look into if you're interested. Standardized work, we've talked about that, reduce the variation so you can make your spaghetti sauce the same time, every way, and actually have it taste good consistently. Value stream mapping, So it's a very interesting way to get people together to talk about that process. So if I looked at this, I would get everyone who flows across this process in a room, we map it out. And then what you do is you actually go do time studies. And you do the time studies and show how long is this process really taking, including all of the wait times. And what it does is you can step back and objectively see where your biggest issues are that you really need to drill into, and actually create then kind of a map of, hey, these are the kaizans, these are the activities we should go after, right, to improve if we really want to make the biggest impact. Visual management, we've talked about, making things so you can see them, so they're not a black hole. Getting to the root cause of why something happens, 6S. So 6S is around, it's like, hey, if I cleaned up my workspace, right? But you can do this in your transactional role too. So I definitely, if, I just did it in my garage the other day. It's super fun. But definitely something to look into. Again, these are just tools if you wanted more information to kind of Google. And then 7 ways. This is a big one I don't think we do enough of. Try storming different ideas. So it's a kind of a forcing function to say, rather than stopping at your first idea of how to do something, they say 7 ways. Sometimes it's hard to come up with 7, but at least try to come up with 3 different ways, right? Usually with a group brainstorming of how you could accomplish something. And oftentimes you'll find that it's a hybrid of the various ways that actually turns out to be the best solution. But the idea is, don't stop at your first idea. It's like, oh, I thought of something done. Okay, that box is checked. So it's just a fun little exercise, fun little tool for brainstorming for process improvement. So at the end of the day, again, this links back to the first slide. If you can do it safer, with higher quality, faster, and more efficiently, you'll improve your customer loyalty, your productivity. And at the end of the day, right, isn't this how you want everyone like walking into their jobs to say, I cannot wait to go to work? You don't want them walking out like that, right? It's not like, hey, I'm leaving, I get to look like that. It's, hey, I get to go to work every day and I get to actually add value. I get to, not just do things that are just redundant and, a machine could do them. I can actually go and continuously improve my role, improve the organization, improve my customer satisfaction, etc. And so the idea is, again, it's just kind of opening or giving you a different lens with which to look at your processes. So now when you do go look at your processes, really think about those 8 wastes and look for them and say, can I see these wastes in my process? And then if you can, how do you help others in your organization to see things the same way, right? It's not like, oh, this is Debbie, this is your process. And therefore, Debbie, if I found, if I say this isn't working well, I'm saying, Debbie, you suck. It's, hey, Debbie, hey, let's learn about waste, right? And how can we sit here and identify ways that we could reduce waste to continuously improve our customer satisfaction, right? Or our employee satisfaction, or whatever Debbie's super passionate about. So now, hopefully you can't unsee them. And now that you can go see your processes through the different lens. So I know we're right on the mark here. Any kind of questions that you have or any comments that anyone has that they'd like to add? Kevin, nothing?
Appreciated it. I mean, could have dragged this out for an hour and a half if you'd have kept me unmuted.
We can talk later. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your time. And again, I hope it's just kind of, gives you a different perspective on how do you look at your processes and for opportunities for improvement.
Thanks, Colleen.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Colleen, for the presentation and for everyone joining. And if anybody has any further questions that they would like to have addressed offline, you can email Colleen, cfons@innovia.com, or you can email your customer success manager, or you can email info@innovia.com. So thank you again, everyone, for presenting or for attending. And thank you, Colleen, for the presentation today. And we look forward to seeing you soon on another Innovia webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.